Spring, Erna Hardy was a good child who grew up to be a fine lady. Now the time had come for her to become a good wife. Receiving a long letter from him was unexpected, and in his reply, he offered her the chance to be his wife. Nonsense, Erna scoffed, collapsing onto the table in frustration after reading and rereading the letter multiple times. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed. She jumped up from her seat and walked to the window. Even though it was raining outside, the spring sun still shone brightly despite being partially obscured by storm clouds. Erna flung the window open with a loud noise, sat on the windowsill, and hugged her knees tightly. From this spot in the mansion on Baden Road, perched on a hill, she could see the entire village. Erna's gaze slowly drifted across the landscape. Her eyes passed over the orchard with blooming apple blossoms, down to the stream winding through the valley, and further up to the hillside covered in vibrant yellow primroses, before finally settling on an old, weathered chair standing alone on the other side. Under the large H tree, the world pays no attention to one person's misfortune. That fact is painfully clear, and it is that very truth that made Erna feel overwhelmed. Even if you lose a loved one and face the danger of being exiled from your hometown, the world keeps turning, brimming with the energy of spring. It remains heartlessly beautiful. "How can a world that creates such beauty be so cruel?" Erna laughed bitterly, filled with sarcasm and sorrow. "And how lucky you are," she thought, her heart aching with memories of him. Lady Erna," Mrs. Fay, the housekeeper, called out to her from the other side of the hall. The sound startled her out of her thoughts almost immediately. "It seems it's time for lunch," the housekeeper added. "I'll be down soon," Erna called back before hurriedly stepping away from the windowsill. She quickly shoved the meaningless letter into the drawer, indifferent to prying eyes, and swiftly tidied up her disheveled appearance. "I'm fine," she told herself as she headed downstairs. In the dining room on the first floor, Ina murmured to herself as if she were praying, "It's okay, everything will be fine." "Ina, have you ever met a lawyer before?" Baroness Baden, who had been arguing about the current weather with a jigsaw puzzle in front of her, finally got to the main point as the meal was about to finish. Ina tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but her eyes revealed an impatience she could not hide. "No, Grandma, I haven't met one yet," Ina replied firmly. "I will meet with him before the end of this week." Sunlight filtered through the window, casting light on Ina, who sat upright and stiff as a proper lady should. Her heart pounded so loudly she could feel it, her lips were cracked, and her mouth felt dry. Her fingers and fingertips trembled restlessly. Fortunately, if Baroness Baden noticed, she didn't ask any further questions. "Yes, that's wonderful, I hope you find a way," she replied politely. A soft sigh escaped into the overly quiet atmosphere of the dining room. Ina lifted her gaze, staring at her hands resting on her lap before glancing at the elderly woman across from her. Within less than a month, the Baroness began to look older and weaker. She had just lost her husband and had to hand over all the remaining property to a nephew she barely knew in just a single day. How could she possibly tell the truth? Erna sat up straight, swallowing her growing anxiety, pressing her lips together with a stubborn promise not to reveal the truth. But in all honesty, she had already consulted a lawyer before. The answer she received was no different from what she already knew. If Baron Baden died without a son, his estate would pass to his nephew. Erna had known from the start that such a ridiculous rule existed. It was frustrating and unfortunate, but without any legal solution, she had to come up with a countermeasure. It was at that moment Erna decided to gradually take on more work and start saving money so that one day she could rightfully buy the house back, which would inevitably fall into someone else's possession. However, she never expected that one day would come so soon, and the amount she had saved was still painfully insufficient. "Believe me, I'm sorry, but this has always been the inheritance law, Miss Hattie. There's nothing more you can do. Only the lawyer can answer her inquiries, no matter how much she pleads with him to find another way to save Baron Baden's house and property. For now, I think it's best to explain the situation to Mrs. Baden and ask for her mercy." After giving advice on the difficult separation, he put the pipe back in his mouth and continued puffing smoke. The lawyer was a harsh man, but Ina endured it. Few lawyers would welcome or entertain clients facing financial hardships and unable to afford even consultation fees. Only a lawyer could help. That day, Ina wrote a letter to Thomas Baden. No matter how much she thought about it, it was hard to find a better solution than the advice from the best lawyer she could find. Today, Thomas Baden's response arrived, turning her faint hope into despair and distant anger almost instantly. "It'll be okay, Grandma, don't worry too much," Ina told her, clenching her teeth and lying just to reassure the old woman. She got up from the table, grabbed an apron, and began helping Mrs. Gave, who had approached her slowly. The two of them skillfully cleared the table. "I'm not okay," she thought bitterly while washing the dishes, but in the end, she couldn't deny the truth she had tried so hard to reject. It is no exaggeration to say that this single country estate was the only remaining asset of the fallen noble family, the Bonbedden. However, this house would soon become the property of Thomas Baden, the rightful and legitimate heir to all the family's possessions upon the Baron's passing. She knew without a doubt that he would sell the estate immediately. She took a deep breath and chose to suppress her growing resentment. The soap suds splattered from her furious scrubbing, leaving small stains on her rolled-up sleeves and apron. Thomas Baden said he understood Ina's wishes very well. However, he had to consider his own circumstances and could not delay the sale of the estate until Baron Baden's death. She wouldn't feel this way if only she had firmly expressed her refusal. After washing the dishes, Erna went to the backyard garden, rolling up her apron and tying it in her hand. Tears streamed down her face as she sat on her grandfather's chair placed under the beautiful ash tree. The absurd proposal had come from Thomas Baden. He offered that if she agreed to be his wife, he would accept any condition she set. Whatever she had done before, her vision of the beautiful autumn scene began to blur before her eyes as they started to sting. But Erna could only blink away the tears that threatened to fall. She just didn't want to cry because that man didn't deserve her tears, the man who had cornered and manipulated his own relatives. He reminded her of her father, another man who couldn't even live up to his age. Father? Erna mumbled absently. It was the name of someone long forgotten, but she was sure he was still there. Yes, her father. Her eyes widened with sudden realization before Erna jumped up from the chair, the apron strings slipping loose and drifting with the spring breeze as it fell to the ground. The sound from outside the tightly closed window and thick curtains was so loud that even Bon could still hear them despite trying to block the noise with a pillow. The cheers and voices. A lively shout that began from the river flowing beside the Grand Duke's residence echoed loudly into the dimly lit bedroom. He tried to sleep again, burying his head into the pillow. Despite pressing his head into the pillow and cushions, he ultimately surrendered to the waking world. Frustrated and full of energy, Bon got out of bed. Finally, when he pulled back the curtains covering the western window, he saw a group of people rowing on the other side of the river. Every summer, the Abai River, which flows from the city to the sea, hosts rowing competitions among the nobles. Since the summer was too long to survive on parties and gossip alone, the attempt to do something else was quite dull because it lacked excitement. However, the problem was that the river was too close to the Grand Duke's residence. From spring, when full practice began, until summer, when the games ended, it was difficult to escape this dreadful noise. Bon leaned against the edge. The window scowled as it watched them sit excitedly, almost obnoxiously, around the cramped boat. He stared intently at the forgetful backs of the boys' heads as if Bon could silence them with sheer force of will if he glared hard enough. If they couldn't control their overflowing energy, at least having a sack would help, he thought incredulously. What madness, he muttered to himself. Having a sack would be a far more useful pastime than indulging in these pointless competitions he so despised. Worst case scenario, you'd need children. Still, at least they would contribute in some small way to the kingdom's growing power through population increase. Of course, in his personal life, it would only bring more hardship, but the tragedy of uncontrollable madmen was beyond his concern or responsibility. After taking a sip of water, warm on the table, Bjorn turned around and brushed his disheveled hair aside. Greg the butler quickly entered his room, picked up his robe, and rang the bell. I apologize, Your Highness. Although we have refused requests for the use of the palace's private lands, we cannot prevent the use of nearby lands, especially when permission has been granted by the Ruber City Hall, Greg promptly informed him as expected. The bell in the Grand Duke's house rang at noon, signaling that he had to hurry to finish the rest of the day's work. He continued speaking, noting that the number of participating teams had increased this year as well, which might make things even more hectic. Bon chuckled with amusement when he heard the noise outside the window grow louder once again. Anyway, Onatir would probably take the championship. Why were these vibrant nerds so obsessed with what they were doing? He complained to Greg incredulously. Would you like to move your bedroom, sir? The butler asked after a moment of silence. No, that's all right, he replied. In that case, we will prepare your meal shortly, the butler said before leaving. Beyond, feeling dissatisfied, ordered only fruit. He shouted the instruction to the butler, who quickly retreated after the brief exchange between master and servant. After the conversation, Bon entered the bathroom and turned on the warm shower. Once he finished bathing, he stepped outside and headed to the balcony, where a table was already set and waiting for him. Bon sipped on a cold whiskey soda while gazing at the scenery beyond his balcony, the waters of the mighty river, renowned as one of the special features of the Schuber Palace. A crystal-clear stream gushed forth, with golden statues adorning the sides of the fountain. The scattered droplets shimmered brightly under the vivid spring sunlight. Bjorn's gaze drifted through the fountain, following the slope of the staircase that connected the Grand Duke's residence to the garden and extended to the waterway beyond, where the river Abiga's distant cheers could still be heard, a testament to how loud they were. The Crown Prince has arrived, sir, Greg announced dutifully as he entered, just as Bjorn set down the last of his iced drink on the table. Bjorn wiped the remaining moisture from his fingers with a napkin, nodded, then picked up an apple and bit into it with satisfaction. Shortly after the butler departed, Leonie stepped in. Entering his bedroom, Leonie collapsed into the seat opposite him. Judging by the sweat on his brow and the flush on his cheeks, it was clear he had run here after rowing practice. Welcome, Crown Prince, Bjorn greeted his younger brother with grace and propriety, a stark contrast to his own relaxed, cross-legged posture. Leonie shook his head and Bjorn watched as droplets of water dripped from the tips of his damp hair. Despite Oni sitting beside him, gazing at him with surprise and excitement, Bjorn could only look down at the large fountain in the garden. He meticulously observed everything, even as the sweetness of the crisp apple filled his mouth with each big bite, mingling with the delicate fragrance of blooming flowers in the air. What brings you here today? He asked. Servants entered to serve tea, but as soon as they left, Bjorn narrowed his eyes at Oni. Schuber, where the Grand Duke's palace was located, was also a summer retreat for many nobles from Lechen. Although it was still early in the season, the crown prince, who was obsessed with court life, had moved to the Schuber palace ahead of time, becoming a significant disruption to his older brother's daily life. Oni could only sigh in despair at his brother's cold welcome. Ignoring the chilly reception, he placed the newspaper he had brought onto the table instead of answering, its headline from one of the most renowned tabloids known more for social gossip than actual news. The glaring image on the front page caught Bjorn's eye. He frowned at the absurd headline and began scanning the news section. "A poisonous mushroom, really?" he asked incredulously, holding up the newspaper as if expecting it to change into a nameplate. His brother, resembling a recent threat he had encountered, merely shrugged indifferently. "I have no idea how they came up with that," Leonie replied before popping a grape into his mouth. "Still, it seems to be the Grand Duke's latest nickname," he teased, winking at his brother. "A poisonous mushroom, something that looks beautiful and tempting but is deadly if consumed." "That's all?" Bjorn glanced back with a cold, unaffected expression, placing the newspaper down with a sly smile tugging at his lips. Yet he couldn't be too upset. They had used a flattering photo of him after all. In fact, he dared to say it was almost a compliment. "Oh, and?" Leonie interjected abruptly, watching Bjorn's expression carefully as he delivered the latest news from around the city. "They say Gaddy is back in Lechen." Just the mention of that single name, Gaddy, erased Bjorn's sly grin in an instant, replacing it with a deep frown. Another article lay on the page, and as he read it properly this time, it detailed that Princess Gisford had decided to spend this summer in Lechen. Sheena Gaddy was once a beautiful princess beloved by all in Lechen, but now she was regarded as the unfortunate woman who had been betrayed and abandoned by her husband, even after losing her child. Indeed, it was the kind of gossip the nobles relished, especially as her former husband, once hailed as the crown prince, was now infamously dubbed the poisonous mushroom by the common folk. Silence hung between the two brothers for a moment before Leonie finally decided to speak. "What are you planning to do, Bjorn?" Bjorn sighed, looking unusually serious and contemplative, so unlike him that it made Leonie laugh. Bjorn took another small bite of his apple, wiping the juice from his fingers as he sank deeper into the chair. His eyes were devoid of emotion, giving no hint of his thoughts on the latest news. He simply remained calm. "Spring has arrived, hasn't it? What a perfect season for poisonous mushrooms to thrive." The morning sky began to brighten as the sun slowly rose, casting a soft purplish-blue glow over the rural station. The day started as the first train bound for Schuber arrived at the platform. After a few hurried passengers boarded, the slightly bustling station quickly fell silent once more. Ina stood frozen in place. She was the last to board the carriage, walking towards it sluggishly as if weighed down by an invisible burden. "Miss, aren't you going to continue your journey?" The station master's sudden question jolted the dazed young woman from her trance as she made her way to the carriage, prompting her to look around anxiously. Her hands, gripping the handle of her suitcase tightly, trembled slightly. "You must have found my letter by now," Ina thought to herself, her eyes darkening at the memory of what she had just done. She couldn't bring herself to tell her grandmother about her plan to meet her father. Ina knew that the Baroness of Baden would rather be left stranded on the streets than seek help from her estranged son-in-law, whom she considered her enemy. Struggling internally, Ina had ultimately decided to leave behind a letter explaining her current situation. In the end, she did something her past self would never have done. The word father was so ordinary, yet to her, it felt foreign and unfamiliar, stirring uneasy feelings within her. The last time they had seen each other was at her mother's funeral 11 years ago. She knew that their relationship was barely any better than that of strangers. No, it was worse than that. Yet now her father was Ina's last hope, even though she knew. The closed door might be the only answer he could give her, but she couldn't stop her heart from racing, whether from anticipation or anxiety, she wasn't sure. With renewed determination, she grabbed her suitcase and took a deep breath. She looked up and faced the train, which gleamed ominously in the morning sunlight before her. "Why haven't you boarded the train yet?" "Not yet," the station master's words brought Ina's thoughts back to the present. She quickly composed herself to clear her mind. "Sorry, I'll board now, I'll board the train," she said, her eyes shining with resolve. Finally, she made her decision. She couldn't turn back now. The current situation didn't give her enough time to indulge in trivial things, and she had to accept her fate. Her trembling steps reminded her of that moment, which was the essence of her life. If life were a stage play, the world would be indifferent to anyone's misfortune. Therefore, your life should be controlled by your own strength. To live like that, we must be able to accept everything life offers with a positive outlook, because nothing changes by struggling with self-pity. Hard work and giving our best with a positive attitude is always better than quitting and surrendering. If Ina's fate was meant to cling to the slim chances, then her hope had to be that way. She would accept and love her fate. However, Wake Hattie remained her father, and as a father, he had duties and responsibilities that he was obligated to fulfill. Despite neglecting these responsibilities for a long time, he still had to adhere to them. In the end, she hurried onto the train, leaving behind the station master with a stern expression. Her hurried movements were followed by the swaying of her intricately floral dress, fluttering like a flower blooming in spring. After leaving her hometown and holding her mother's hand, Ina had finally returned home, though this time she was alone. Her long journey had begun, and whether it ended in happiness or tragedy, no one could say. Bjorn, sitting impeccably and gracefully in the beautiful living room bathed in spring sunlight, slowly placed his teacup down with a gesture that matched his composed demeanor. His posture, with his long legs crossed, resembled a lazy leopard stretching in the sun. "Are you still listening to me?" A woman's voice interrupted the tranquil scene in the living room. "Why aren't you answering? Does that mean the article is real? Is it true?" A barrage of questions came one after another, each louder than the last. The man tiredly rubbed his face, ensuring that the tea had reached the right temperature before he picked up his cup again and took a sip. The warm, fragrant liquid flowing down his throat helped calm his disoriented mind. After being ignored for so long, the irate woman stood up. The sunlight poured down on her, making her stand out like a spotlight on a stage, in contrast to the man sitting quietly in front of her, impeccably dressed. She looked like a still lake, her appearance now all the more striking. Her pale appearance became even more pronounced. She couldn't entirely blame herself for her current state, as she had rushed from the capital after receiving the news. Bjorn looked up, now accustomed to the brightness of midday. He then looked at the woman who was clearly distressed, facing him. When he returned home around dawn after taking a bath, he threw his exhausted body onto the bed to sleep. The sky was already bright, and it was safe to say that the tired man knew it was still midnight, not the right time for him to be awake, let alone deal with such trivial matters. He opened his eyes. His eyes were fully open, gleaming like the most exquisitely beautiful gems, and he leaned back deeply into the chair. From the window by the river, the sound of rowing echoed as the athletes preparing for the upcoming competition seemed to be training hard as well. It was a good way to start his day, with a mix of frustration and amusement. He picked up the newspaper, reluctantly tossed aside by the distressed woman who had faced him earlier. The front page was filled with the latest news and gossip, the same articles from the newspaper that Owen had brought earlier. The spark of love between the former crown prince and his former empress had been ignited. Reliable information came from his closest aide. He glanced at the headline, missing the large photograph of himself, then read the article below with narrowed eyes. According to a report from a close colleague who wished to remain anonymous, the atmosphere between the former couple was unusual at the moment. It wasn't wise to forgive an ex-lover, especially after such disgraceful actions. Yet it seemed that Princess Gatti, with her fragile heart, might be under the influence of something. Could there be a chance for them to fall in love again? With such heated news, the social circle of Lechen was in turmoil, even hotter than the summer sun. The carefully written words made the entire article complete. The meticulous attention to detail in the writing made it clear that the well-taken photo was the only advantage the newspaper had. With a small smile, he casually put the newspaper down. The woman, who had been watching him with shallow breaths, now showed clear disdain on her face. "You don't even have the courage to explain yourself to me?" she asked, her fists clenched tightly as she stared at the handsome young man. On the other hand, Bjorn listened to her calmly. "Let's break up," he said solemnly after waiting for a response, expecting one or even just a word. Her reaction was immediate, but alas, she received nothing in return. The only thing left for her to do was to make the first move. Finally, the former crown prince stared at her. "I don't think there's any reason for us to continue this relationship much longer. You've already asked for my hand, and we will be engaged by the end of this spring," he declared boldly. Contrary to the triumph and confidence in her voice, her eyes betrayed her impatience and an expectation that could not be hidden. However, he continued to gaze at her, slowly moving his hand toward her. His subtle gesture made their time together even more enjoyable compared to other highborn ladies. Moreover, both of them were well aware of the nature of their relationship. They knew they would soon return to their respective lives to fulfill their duties after their shared moments of joy. That was what he had in mind, until she angrily stormed over, shouting loudly about Guy Ford while grabbing the cheap tabloid in her hand. "Congratulations on your upcoming engagement, Lady Sebin," she said with a smile, her words accompanying the smoke from his cigarette as it drifted. The soft puff of smoke escaped his lips, but his words sent a chill through Lady Perez. If someone unaware of the true nature of their relationship had heard this, they might have mistaken his words for nothing more than a soft, encouraging whisper meant for a close friend. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. His response left her mind momentarily frozen. She blinked slowly as she processed his words. Her shock faded after a moment, replaced by a cold anger and humiliation. "You're cold-hearted, selfish to the core, despicable. How could you do this to me after we've spent all this time together?" "You're the one who wanted to leave, not me," he replied calmly, using his fingertip to tap the edge of his cup. "I've only fulfilled your wish. That's what you wanted, wasn't it?" he asked, tilting his head to the side, his shiny hair moving in sync with the motion like silk. Upon hearing his question, all she could do was bite her lip in frustration, silent and seething. "What?" Bjorn stood up and walked out, leaving behind her mortifying figure. She knew she couldn't respond. A small wisp of smoke from the cigarette he had discarded drifted slowly out the window, filling the room with its scent. "Wait!" she suddenly screamed, halting him from leaving. He would not bother to turn back. The only response to her call was a glance to the side. "Is that all you have to say to me as your lover, the beautiful young lady of the Perez family?" she asked through her tears, looking like a rose drenched in morning dew. Sadly, such an irresistible beauty had no effect on him. He slowly turned to his former lover, bowing politely. His back was filled with dignity, and his loose clothing couldn't hide his regal stature that was befitting of royalty. "I will await the good news of the engagement," Bjorn replied with a small smile on his lips, which appeared redder than usual due to the afternoon sun. He turned away, leaving Lady Perez, whose senses seemed to be drifting away, behind. As the door to the parlor closed, they encountered Miss Fit, who was standing by the door. She followed him like a shadow as they walked quietly down the hallway. "Are you planning to sing me a lullaby while I sleep?" he asked playfully with a gentle smile on his lips as they stood before the bedroom door. "I could do that if it's what you wish," she replied. "Unfortunately, there are matters that need your attention, Your Highness," Miss Fit responded, her tone as strict as ever. Now, as the former nurse of the prince, she was managing the household matters at the Schubert Palace. Despite her hair having turned white and her transformation into an older woman, her straightforward personality remained unchanged. "You must go to the station." "The train will be here soon, Your Highness," the station master asked with confusion. "The Queen will be arriving soon as well." What about today?" The realization came to him, and he finally remembered today's schedule. It was the day his mother, who had been invited to a charity event at the Royal Hospital, would visit Schubert. The responsibility of escorting the Queen naturally fell on him. "That's right, Your Highness, we will depart soon, let's go." He accepted his duty with a small nod. As the train traveled through several towns, more passengers began boarding the train heading towards Schubert. Some cabins, which were originally occupied by only one person, were now completely full. Ina, sitting near the window, observed the rapidly passing scenery with a mix of curiosity and careful anxiety. Countless pedestrians and carriages passed by along the web-like streets between the dense buildings. Everything seemed complex and overwhelming. Her eyes felt as if they were spinning around the bustling atmosphere of the city, making her anxious. What if she got lost? What if she couldn't find her father? "Don't worry too much. I still remember the address. I can find my father easily as long as I remember it," she reassured herself. She tried to calm her anxiety. This was the city where she was born and raised. Although she hadn't lived here for more than 5 years, her hometown was still here. With this thought circling in her mind, the train finally reached its final destination, which was the central station of Schubert. She quickly grabbed her bag and exited the train car with the other passengers. Her ribbon was tightly tied under her chin, and her intricately braided hair swayed with her confident stride. However, her proud appearance was quickly crushed by the scene before her. "Where am I? Why am I here?" Looking around, she finally realized how much had changed since her last visit. Schubert, as she remembered it, was gone. 5 years had erased all traces of it. Ina, dazed and confused, was pushed around by impatient passengers disembarking the train, giving her no chance to regain her composure. She stood foolishly on the station platform until her senses slowly returned. Crowds moved in and out, the noise of conversations and activities overwhelming her senses. The constant din of voices filled her ears. She tried to find an exit, but the more she tried, the more trapped she felt, as if the place had become a maze designed to ensnare her. "Look, there he is!" Suddenly, a shout full of excitement echoed across the busy station. Strangely now, everyone's attention on the crowded platform turned in the same direction towards Ina. Holding the suitcase she almost dropped, she turned toward the source of the commotion. At that moment, she realized that she was standing at the front of the crowd. Among the onlookers, she spotted a tall man slowly making his way from the other side. Despite being surrounded by the crowd, Bjorn showed no sign of tension on his face or in his actions. After receiving the attention and focus of the entire kingdom since the moment he was born, such scenes were familiar to him, so familiar that he could handle large crowds naturally, as easily as breathing. However, this also meant that the slight discomfort he occasionally felt when dealing with such attention was not new to him. As he stepped back, everyone made way. The shouts and roars of his attendants echoed through the bustling scene. Even amid the chaos and noise, the spectators could still hear the shouts and gradually stepped aside, creating a path. With his posture upright and full of dignity, he walked through the crowd, which parted for him. He exchanged greetings with those who approached and interacted with the people courteously. This behavior had become second nature to him after repeating it countless times over the years. Now it was deeply ingrained in him. She, on the other hand, was just a spectator in the busy crowd, standing there to watch him without any particular intention. However, due to the distinctive nature of the small young woman in the crowd, he found himself staring at her a little longer than necessary. She wore an old-fashioned rural dress laced with ribbons, making it seem as if she had lived through the entire past century alone. As if the outdated floral dress wasn't enough, the hat she wore complemented her attire perfectly, enhancing the aesthetic of her ensemble with a thoughtfulness that seemed timeless. With such thoughts swirling in his mind, he walked past the intriguing woman. However, his gaze quickly returned to her once more. This time, his focus shifted to a man, clearly distressed, who shouted loudly. The man, red-faced, who had once criticized the prince for being a reckless son of the royal family, staggered behind after receiving the prince's unexpected, intense stare. Contrary to what he had expected, the prince smiled gently at him, offering the same warm smile he gave to everyone. Amid the chaos of admiration and criticism, the prince remained calm and poised, as if he were casually strolling through a royal garden on a peaceful afternoon. He walked leisurely toward the train, now pulling into the station, ignoring the blank faces he no longer wished to remember. Put your mind to everything and you can do it no matter what happens, Ina had once thought. However, after wandering for what seemed like an eternity, exhausted, she realized that simply having the right mindset was not always enough. Knowing the address hadn't helped much, and the darkness had already enveloped the city as night fell. At present, she stood alone in a plaza on Thera Street, with a fountain in the center, her weary body tired from the journey. She didn't forget to place her handkerchief down first, in case she could lie down for a moment to relax her fatigued body, but she knew that such an act would not be appropriate for a woman like herself. Today, she had chosen to wear a special muslin dress, a gift from her grandmother on her birthday last year. She was aware that she didn't know her father very well, but that didn't excuse any behavior lacking the proper manners and dignity that a lady should maintain. That was why she had to keep her dress clean, even if it meant enduring the difficulty of doing so. Calm and graceful at all times and in all places, just as a true lady of high standing should be. This was the life philosophy her grandmother had held dear throughout her life, and a legacy she wished to pass on to her beloved granddaughter. Although she had inherited the Hardy surname, she, as a lady of the Baden family, had the duty to follow her grandmother's teachings. Thinking of her grandmother, she carefully adjusted her dress, returning it to its proper form under the soft light of a gas lamp. Around her, the surroundings began to brighten as the lamplighter moved along, one streetlight at a time. He then proceeded to the next area with his bicycle after finishing his work in the plaza. The unfamiliar scene captivated her without any clear reason, and her thoughts swirled for a moment, lost in the experience. After immersing herself in something she had never seen before in her life, Ina stood up straight, grabbing her suitcase without a second thought, ignoring her swollen feet and legs. Unknowingly, she continued to do what she needed to, searching for her father's house before nightfall. With renewed strength, she walked along the street bathed in the light from the gas lamps. The view was so beautiful, almost like a dream, which helped divert her attention from the anxiety and fear she had been feeling. The soft fluttering of fallen flower petals carried by the wind, along with the first snowfall, helped calm her tense nerves. "Wow," Ina exclaimed, looking up like an innocent child, gazing at the full moon shining through the branches of the flower-laden trees. It was the same bright moon that had kept her company the previous night as she tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. The familiar moonlight brought a sense of peace to her restless mind. Taking a deep breath, she continued down the hallway with even more determination. Surprisingly, it felt as though the moon had blessed her. Finally, she found the house she had been searching for, almost to the point where she had silently prayed with sincerity in her heart. A grand old mansion located at the end of Terret Street stood before her. It was the very same mansion that had once been her home. Perhaps it's worth checking her outfit again. She checked her outfit once more to ensure she was presenting the best version of herself possible. She stood tall, maintaining a slight smile on her lips, just as a refined lady should. She wasn't sure if her appearance was quite right, but by her own standards it was enough. It would be fine, even though she knew there was a chance things might end well. Still, she couldn't help but deceive herself with such comforting lies. She reached for the mansion's doorbell with trembling hands. "I really don't understand what's going on in your head." The excited voice of a woman pierced through the music playing around the lively hall. Bon sat with her eyes closed, and when she opened them, she stared blankly ahead. The young woman Lu, his younger sister, stood before him, who knew when she had arrived. In any case, her excited appearance was in stark contrast to his dry reaction to her. "They said Gaddy was coming back. Do you know what that means?" she asked excitedly. And with a brief pause, his gaze, which had been scanning the room filled with glittering chandeliers, turned back to her. "I guess it'll be an unlucky summer or something like that," he replied, his tone blunt with no attempt at politeness. His straightforward answer, spoken with a bright smile, sounded pitiful due to his monotone voice, which was laced with sleepiness. "Oh my God. How can you speak about Gaddy like that, my dear brother?" Louis asked angrily. "Gaddy, the woman you hurt and tossed aside?" She questioned him as if he had insulted her. In return, he calmly picked up a glass of water while his sister wept beside him, letting the droplets of water fall onto the glass's surface and trickle down his long, smooth fingers. The charity ball continued without any signs of ending anytime soon, clearly indicating its success. Ladies from various social circles headed towards Chawarren as the arrival of the queen, beloved and respected by the entire kingdom, was revealed to the public. The head of the royal hospital showed no sign of stopping her smile in response to the outpouring of kindness being shown. Their donations, beautiful music, exquisite food, and notable individuals from various social circles as guests made the party an event that brought no shame to the queen's dignity, ensuring her attendance was not in vain. Similarly, it could be said for the period spent away from rest to guard the queen, as his efforts were rewarded as well. Overall, everyone enjoyed the spring weekend except for one princess who seemed to have just thrown a tantrum. "Brother, can you please fix your mistake right now?" she said, her tone purposefully trying to please him. Her friend, who supported their marriage more eagerly than anyone else, was very important when it came to matters concerning the two of them after their chaotic separation. Of course, it wasn't a mistake that could be easily forgiven, but if Gaddy accepts your apology, I'm sure you two will make it work. He smiled as his sister's words interrupted him while he placed the glass of water he was holding opposite his cheerful smile. His eyes and tone were so calm it felt unfamiliar. It seemed the Duke was searching for his wife. I think it's time she should return to her husband's side, he said, pointing toward the Duke of Ha, who was walking through the crowd of women across the hall. Louis, who wanted to say more, ended up swallowing her complaints with a sigh and reluctantly left him after a brief pause. Once the royal orchestra began playing again, the song filled the entire hall. Bond stood up from his seat and walked forward. He passed by nonchalantly amid the ladies who secretly watched him, their gazes intertwined with caution and expectation, but he paid no attention to them. He walked toward the balcony that led to the garden, now occupied by a man smoking a cigar. The familiar face waved him over and he turned to face the man. A group of nobles who were usually engrossed in meaningless conversation appeared unusually quiet tonight. Some even sipped their drinks with downcast faces like children on the verge of tears, ready to break down at any moment. Their investments had failed. Peter, holding a glass filled with amber brandy, said to Bon, leaning on the balcony rail and holding his glass in his hand. The investment, or rather their investment in foreign bonds, turned out to be a scam or something like that. Peter clicked his tongue and delivered the sad news. He frowned slightly. It seemed that the number of fools sunk into investments that were too good to be true was greater than he had anticipated. This type of investment had been a trend that had been stirring up the social circles for some time now. Thanks to the prince, I am still alive. Thanks to your help, Peter, Bon said. Peter, who moved closer to Bon, whispered softly. Just a few days ago, Peter had heard news about a profitable investment that piqued his interest. After gathering enough information, he went straight to Chewerin Palace to seek cooperation from Bian. It was a well-known rumor in social circles that the prince's fortune with women and wealth had never been greater, to the point where some nobles believed even the gods had blessed him. However, Bian shattered the dream of the excited nobles without mercy. After hearing the situation, Bian asked, "Is your brain just for decoration?" Peter Bergen was so insulted that he nearly rebelled, considering attacking a member of the royal family. If his opponent had been a mere common noble or someone he could easily defeat, he wouldn't have thought twice about overcoming such a fool. But alas, with a rational mind, he reasoned that protecting himself and his family was more important than beating the fool, especially if that fool was the prince. There was nothing in the kingdom he couldn't endure. Furthermore, he had received tremendous profits from an investment in a steel company with the information he had received from Bon earlier. Just thinking about the income from that investment was enough for Peter to confess his deep love for the prince. A small investment has already brought in this much money. How much would the prince make in the end? Overthinking won't help him earn more. To secure a large amount of capital is a talent in itself, and one must have enough wit to survive in this field. This reason alone was enough for Peter to maintain his friendship with the prince, even if it meant putting up with his frequent rudeness. "You must catch them by whatever means necessary, your highness," the heir to Betzer exclaimed as he began to list the names of the wrongdoers, frustrated. Most of the names were the children of noble families known to be related to each other, but there were also unfamiliar names on the list. "Do you know why Kaad? He's one of the unluckiest victims. All his fortune was taken from him. Maybe he'll commit suicide using a pistol now." The voice of the affected nobleman ended with an unfamiliar name he had never heard before. Perhaps people saw Wai Kaad as the biggest fool among all the foolish victims, Bon thought as he lit a cigarette in his hand. He then turned his gaze towards the garden beyond the balcony rail, through the mist of smoke, and saw the colorful spring flowers in full bloom. Above the rising water, the scene was gradually coming into full view, and he slowly took in the view. His gaze suddenly stopped on an archway of flowers with small white flowers within it, Lily of the Valley. His eyes, which were focused on the flowers, narrowed slightly as he remembered its name. It was the same flower that Gaddy had held during their wedding. For this reason, the Lily of the Valley, known as the prince's flower, became beloved by many to the point of being scarce for a while. Of course, the popularity didn't last long and faded in less than a year. That interesting woman at the hat station adorned with this flower, which has long since gone out of fashion, Bon thought as he hummed along to the music playing. In the hall, as he exhaled the smoke from his cigarette, it was no surprise that he turned his gaze away from the flower arch without any regret and looked up at the white moon floating in the night sky. Although he diverted his attention from the flower, it seemed as though he would continue to face everything related to Gaddy, like some kind of curse that had fallen upon him.